not getting too many this time around, but we're gonna take a year to actually like give myself time to do it, and
So you're not graduating this
we will see if anyone takes me.
added on the second degree
I have high hopes now that I actually have. It's not like I didn't realize how much work grad school applications were gonna be, so I kind of put them off to the last minute and went, oh,
It's really sad.
this is. I kind of assumed each one would be like kind of the same, and then it was like, no, actually, we're gonna need an entirely new essay review for this.
I think it's that and then I said, can I have a
Looking for the professor later who says
and then
also
also
Yeah, I think now that I know it,
okay, I'll read this.
I'll have so much time in my life to be like, I specifically want this professor, I've read your work, and I really like this, and this.
Okay, we're good?
Sure.
First, out of curiosity, my intent was that the reading would be the very start and very end of the chapter. Did everyone figure that out, or did anyone try and read like all 70 pages? If so, I'm sorry, because it was a lot.
No, I think I put
Yeah.
You did. I just didn't know. I just didn't know if it was clear. Like because there's the page numbers, and I didn't know if someone like didn't read the page numbers and just stopped at like the.
It's their problem.
Okay, that is their problem. My other thought.
Everything is our problem. Even if Canvas doesn't work, it's our
You want some
problem.
other?
No, that's no problem. That's
I guess everything being your problem is a good segue into this. I don't actually have teaching evaluations, but if anybody has any feedback, because I've never like instructed a class before, or if you have other Deleuze questions, etc., that's my email. I'll probably respond. But my response is just going to be it's your problem. Figure it out. And then my last plug before the lecture is I reread more of this chapter than I thought I would, because every time I go back to this, I will die on the hill that this is like the greatest, like this chapter is the greatest piece of philosophy ever written. I don't even think the parts we read are like the best parts of it. And if you want to take my word for it and want to be like quirky about it and not just read out of 1,000 plateaus, there's like a pocket-sized edition of the War Machine plateau you can get, which I think is very, very cool. I liked the way that the lecture on Thursday went, so I figured I would do the same thing, where these are kind of some themes that I noticed or picked up on as I was reading it, and so we can start again with kind of like a discussion about anything that jumped out to people, and we'll go to the slides that are relevant. I also included the becoming slide from last time in case anyone wasn't clear on it, because it was like the very end of class. Also, in the parts of this chapter that they don't read, don't worry about this text. There's a lot of text. But they talk about gravity, and so I was just going to have this in case Rose was here, because it's a better description of gravity than me last time. So let the record show that Deleuze and Guattari do have a theory of gravity. I'll leave it up if anyone wants to make their head spin a little bit. Okay, did anyone have anything from the reading that jumped out to them?
Oh, I was gonna say.
Were you raising your hand? Okay.
Start with becoming again.
Yes, we can start with becoming. I guess like I speed ran this slide last time, so I did actually read through all of it. Is there a question about becoming, or part of it's unclear, or?
so.
You
No,
had
you go. You had the question.
I was gonna just like say I felt like I didn't quite understand what becoming was doing as a concept. Like after that, and like we had 5 minutes at the end of class.
Right,
so.
like what is the importance of becoming in their work,
Like,
kind of, or?
What's the difference between like what exactly does becoming entail? Like, because obviously it's not literally you are taking on the form of a wolf or
Right.
something, but like what kind of implications, I guess, does this have in like becoming wolf as opposed to like thinking like a wolf or just like literally being a wolf?
So do you want to answer that, or?
Yeah, I think
Okay.
when D&G sort of talk about becoming, at least the way I understand it, is that you might take on like particular intensities that like say a wolf might have. So like you might try and walk on all fours. I think that was something that they talked
Right.
about in the last reading. So for them, it's not like literally about, like you said, transforming into a a wolf, right? It's just taking on certain, what they would say is intensities, but like I would interpret as like attributes or characteristics of a wolf.
Right, which I would sort of filter through the sort of broader argument they have about the way that, you know, a machine doesn't have an essence outside of an assemblage. And I think maybe the example of Judge Schraber, like turning into a woman, is an example of this. Because when Schraber has this becoming woman, the way that they kind of read it is like his breasts become erogenous zones, as if he was a woman. Like he's having a literal experience of his breasts are more sensitive and like, you know, he feels a certain shame when they're visible, etc. And his breasts have not like physically changed. And yet there's an intensity within them that means that he is going to interact with them differently, that other people should probably interact with him differently, and that functionally, like, his breast machines have taken on a different becoming, they're outputting a different intensity. And so I think that becoming is largely a question of intensity in what kind of machine, or what kind of intensity the machine that is becoming will now output. So yeah, it's not necessarily a question of physical change. It's more of a question, I guess, of, you know, how do the new intensities a machine is taking on lead to changes, either physical or, you know, like in a more like emotional, how do you interact with it kind of way.
Okay, so like rerouting intensities towards like new outputs. Almost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it feels like, I think you kind of mentioned this before, and I don't remember the exact wording. It feels important though. But it's like, this is like I don't really have like identity, but like becoming is like serves that kind of like
Right.
function in their philosophy.
Yeah, and so I think broadly they would say, I mean, they only used the term like zone of intensity like twice, and I used it like 400 plus times when I was writing about them. But you can think of it as broadly analogous to becoming, and I think the thing that they're trying to get at broadly with their philosophy is the way you interact with things should not be based on what their being is or what their essence is, but based on the becoming it's having or what zones of intensity are currently operative on their body without organs. And so, yeah, I agree that it's kind of it's a substitute for identity, and it's a more kind of fluctuating or changing one. And they think that that's kind of what you should like latch onto when you're interacting with a person.
And so is there like is becoming a constant process? Is everything always becoming
Yes.
something?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
There's a line towards the end of Anti-Oedipus that I like where they're like, within every becoming is a becoming death. And so there's two kinds of death. There's the death that's always happening, and there's like death, like capital D, which is actually when you cease dying or whatever, which I think is kind of a fun. But yeah, they're like everything is becoming all the time. You can't really stop it. So if you don't like becoming, I'm sorry. You're condemned to this forever.
So how would they square that with sort of like a physicist view of the world, where it's like the universe started from the Big Bang and everything originates from that point, and that there might have been a period before that Big Bang. Would they say like this nothingness is like becoming the Big Bang and eventually all the universe?
I think there's maybe two kinds of things. First of all, I think if they were to describe what the universe is like before the Big Bang, they would probably say it is a body without organs, or they use the metaphor of an egg to describe a body without organs a lot of times. It's like it has a lot of potentials that can unfold based on where and when the egg is stimulated. So I think that might be how they characterize before the Big Bang. It's like the universe has this potential to unfold. And the other thing, I haven't read as much of Deleuze's solo later work, but I know that he talks, and I think he's using Leibniz to develop this, but like the fold or unfolding is a concept. And so, I don't know, there might be some articulation of how the universe is unfolding. But I do think that like Deleuze and Guattari are not necessarily anti-determinism in the sense that they would say like even if everything can be traced back to the Big Bang, as things undergo changes, there's like still a becoming happening, even if it's like predetermined, even if it's outside of their control. You know, like even if it is true that all of everything that we do can be traced back to the Big Bang, like it seems like we still undergo relatively different things that would change how you interact with people, I think. Other questions about becoming? Or any thoughts about the War Machine Nomadology plateau?
So the War Machine feels kind of analogous to the concept of the nomad. I think they said that like the it wasn't the.
It's the invention of the nomads,
Yeah,
and then it's like it's not the nomad that defines these characteristics, but the characteristics that define the nomad. Yeah.
So can you speak to like the relation of the war machine to the nomad and how that kind of like pair or relates back to like the state? Because I know that's like a huge focus of that chapter. It feels
Yes.
very like this is like where they get kind of like political with a lot of these like concepts.
Okay. So this was, I don't know, I like the way it's written. There's like propositions or whatever. The second proposition, the one like right after you stopped reading, is the one that talks about Clastres, who is a French anthropologist. And the argument that Clastres broadly makes as he analyzes primitive societies is he wants to critique this thesis that is, I think, dominant in anthropology at the time that Deleuze and Guattari are writing, that primitive or nomadic societies are a lower stage of evolution. That like all humans, if you put them alone, are eventually going to develop like agricultural society. They're going to have a state, they're going to have leaders, laws, etc. And the nomads were just underdeveloped, they hadn't figured that out yet. And so they're like on a linear track to turning into a state. And Clastres looks at anthropological evidence of groups, I think in South America, but I could be wrong about that, and finds that they have leadership mechanisms within them that are actually constructed with the specific purpose of preventing leadership from becoming centralized. And so his rereading of this thesis is that the nomadic or primitive societies are not like a lower step on the evolutionary ladder, but they are a different form of societal organization, and they are actively opposed to a state. They are trying to prevent it from forming. And so I think it's kind of interesting. This was also not in the reading, but I assume that most people are at least passingly familiar with like the Hobbesian theory of the state, that like in the state of nature, mankind is at war, and that's just the most miserable thing possible, which is why the state develops, is because we all agree that the state of nature would be bad. And so they have this kind of rereading of Hobbes where it's like, inverted as well, that as the state is against war, the war is against the state. And they also want to say we should rethink about what war in the Hobbesian sense means, where it is not the like evil state of nature, but it is rather a social state that wards off and prevents the state. And so the connection between nomadism and the war machine, I think, is the extent to which nomads demonstrate these characteristics that are analyzed throughout the chapter, the plateau, that are forms of organization that prevent the crystallization of powers into a single leader or a single centralized mechanism like the state. Is kind of the broad thought about that question. If people have other questions about the war machine, you're welcome to answer this, but something that I thought that was interesting and I would ask you all about as I was reading is, so one of the things that they want to say that I think is kind of important, which is this top right quote, is like the war machine for Deleuze and Guattari is probably not how we would typically think of like a, when people are like critiquing a military war machine where like everything is going towards making warfare all the time. They want to say basically the opposite, where the war machine is really just nomad existence. It fights for the kind of continuation of a nomad mode of existence, and it only becomes like belligerent or only takes war as its object if it collides with a state. And they describe this in three different ways that cites other philosophers that I imagine you all are more familiar with than I am. They say for Aristotle, war would be neither the condition or the object, but necessarily accompanies it. Speaking like Derrida, it would be the supplement. And speaking like Kant, it would be the necessary but synthetic relation. So I don't know if those lines mean anything to anyone, but I know that there's some people in this class that know more about Aristotle, Derrida, Kant than I do. And so if anyone thinks those are interesting lines or wants to say something about those, you're welcome to. Or broadly, if anyone has other questions about the war machine or the rest of this chapter.
I know when they were talking about the war machine, they brought up the analogy of chess versus Go.
Yes.
Can you explain like what the difference is? So they talk about chess being sort of like institutionalized. All the pieces have to play a very specific role, and the point is to capture a certain amount of territory. Territory with like minimal resources.
Right.
Expended. But they talk about Go being like all the pieces are sort of interchangeable. They don't have any specific role or purpose. space is like taken and given very, very easily. How is this relating back to the War Machine exactly?
Okay. So I think that this is what they're trying to demonstrate here is a concept of exteriority. I think the quote is rather interesting. They're like, it is not enough to say the war machine is exterior to the state. Rather, it is a pure form of exteriority. I think that this is kind of interesting in like a political sense, where there's a lot of times where, you know, the discussion of different groups or like, you know, quote unquote marginalized groups is like what's just the outside of the state. There's like an inside and the outside, and their definition is just that, you know, they're outside. So it's like a relative definition. Whereas D&G want to say that for the nomads at least, there's this form of exteriority, which does not mean that they're like the outside of an inside. It's not a relative thing, but it's just like a pure form of kind of outsideness. And the Go versus chess analogy is a way they try to demonstrate this. So have you played Go?
No,
I think I've played the Game Pigeon equivalent of it, but I've never actually played Go.
I used to play chess competitively, which is why this actually
Yeah.
Go was
I like chess way more than Go.
Go was really hard to get into because of how like when that analogy popped up, I was like, oh holy shit, because it feels like so like indicative of the whole kind of like dichotomy is the wrong word, but the kind of contrast they put between like arborescent thought and rhizomatic thought.
Yeah.
Because when in Go you can put anything on the board, like you can put your piece on the board anywhere.
Okay.
And like, can I come up there for a second? Like,
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
You're
so,
a Go expert.
And I'm very bad at Go. I'm horrible at Go, but some of my friends are really good at it. So I've like heard them talk about it a lot. So it's like, and it's like if you put a white piece like here, it changes the strength of this of these two pieces. And there's certain structures that are like weak structures, and there's certain structures that are like strong structures that resist capture. There's structures that there's like dead shapes essentially, which means it's like they can be captured at any time, but you can't really save them at all. But there's shapes that like, but if black plays a wrong move, it can be saved somehow. So it's like you have like if you put a white piece right here, you capture those two black pieces, and it would also like change it, like any piece you put down, it changes the structure and like the meaning and the shapes of every single other piece on the board, which feels like the whole concept of like a rhizome, where it's like you can't add anything or take anything away without changing the structure of the entire like board.
Yeah.
And that feels like kind of opposed to chess, where it's like there is it's very like schematic almost. It's like you can kind of you have like with Go it feels more intuition based, because chess it's like you can rely on theory until like 30 moves deep where you get into a completely unique position. You know, like you can attest to that, like where it's like
yeah, I'm not sure if I necessarily agree that chess would be aberrant then. I think especially when you get into endgames, so like when there's very few pieces on the board.
It's rather rhizomatic, I agree.
Yeah. There's certain parts of like if you take like a pawn out from like say it was placed on the 6th rank for white, so and black has a pawn on like the 3rd rank, that changes the game like entirely. You know what I mean? You could have been equal, you could have been winning, but now it's like you change that one pawn and the entire dynamic of the game like it's rapidly changed. I also think in the middle game, I would argue the middle game is probably the most rhizomatic, because there's so many more pieces on the board that a piece, let's say, on your queen side could definitely, like, say you have a knight on the queen side, that could be influencing, say, like, your pawn position in the center. Let's say your knight, like, defends the pawn chain that you have on, like, d4 or d5. Like, all of a sudden, you taking that knight, moving away from the queen side, like, say you either gets traded off or you move somewhere else. Now your center has been slightly destabilized. You might have to worry about that. So I don't necessarily agree that chess is fully aberrant. I think there's a rising.
No, I do agree.
Especially with like more closed games where it's like if you have like something like Rudy Lopez and you're playing a very like strategic like
like something like an Italian game or like maybe a Queen's game.
Yeah, and I guess this is like, you know, I think D&G do this a lot, and it helped me reading them, because like the first time I read this, I was like, oh my god, I think chess is fascist, and I like playing chess. I was like so sad. But I think they do this kind of thing a lot. Like I don't think D&G literally are like trees are like evil, and we should just grow grass. They're trying to point to a characteristic, but I think, you know, given their general theory about assemblages, they would obviously be like it's possible to play chess in a rhizomatic way.
I thought what stood out to me was they made like the point, like I said earlier, is that chess was like a very institutionalized game that had like specific hierarchies and rules. Whereas Go is like you said, Arrow was saying rhizomatic in the sense that, you know, this completely deinstitutionalized, all the pieces function essentially the same. You can claim any space you essentially want, blah blah blah. So I thought that distinction that they made was interesting because I felt like it related somehow back to the War Machine. I just wasn't sure.
I do,
how
and
they were trying to communicate.
I think, do you want to say something about this?
Yeah,
Okay.
I feel like the way that it, like, to start with rhizomatically, I feel like the way that, like, chess feels arborescent is, like, in the fact that there's, like, a goal to get to, like, almost the reverse of it. It's not one thing that branches outward, but, like, a branching of paths that inevitably end in, like, the capture or at least the making king unable to move in the game. Whereas Go, there's no, like, point at which, like, there's no central point by which the whole game, like, becomes, like, over. Like, every point is, in theory, just as valuable. Like, obviously, you know, controlling the corner is different than controlling the middle. But I felt like it was just, like, this way in which space, like, in the chessboard is very pointed towards the kings. Like, it's, like, has an almost hierarchy of how the pieces need to move and get there. Whereas Go, it feels like the way that space exists is less of a transient, like, from here where I start to there where the king is, and more of like a shifting area that has to be, like, maintained and understood throughout all of its portions, in the same way that, like, a nomad society isn't, like, structured toward, like, you know, the capital city in which
Right.
all trade flows towards, but, like, a mass in which all things need to be considered independently but coexistently.
Right. I don't disagree with that. I do think that, kind of on Sahaj's point, there's like I think middle game chess feels a little bit less, like, linear towards, like, it's all centered around checkmate. Things like accumulating piece advantages.
Ultimately, like, you're correct, right? Even if you were in the middle game to try and create an advantage, say on the queen side and completely ignore a king side attack, ultimately the goal would be to overwhelm your opponent on the queen side, create such a significant advantage that either they have to resign, or if left unabated, you would be able to check them
Right.
at some point.
Okay, so then that makes sense. The other thing I have, like, the intrinsic properties, which was the line from their description of this that stuck out to me, because I guess this gets to your sort of point is how it interacts with the War Machine is, like, within chess, a piece has an intrinsic property or, like, an interior. Like, there is a specific set of characteristics that it does. And maybe, like, you know, you have a knight in a certain configuration or opening, and it does a different thing, but it's like a modification derived from those intrinsic properties. Whereas you take a Go piece, and there really isn't, like, an intrinsic property to the piece. Everything that the piece does is a function of whatever constellation on the board you put it in, which is, I think, you know, it's a lot more rhizomatic. It's kind of like the wolf pack we talked about, or it's the description of the body without organ as like a n-1 or an n=0, where it starts with nothing and then it is filled up, rather than having a sort of hole that you deviate from. And I think that this is sort of important for the way that D&G think about both the War Machine broadly, but I think especially kind of identity, and especially a nomadic identity. They don't want to say that there's and I'll go to the next slide because I think this quote kind of gets at that. They don't want to say that there is, like, an interior identity, like people are individual selves closed off from other selves, which would be the model of kind of an interior, and there's, like, an other exterior to myself. But rather they want to say that, you know, existence is this pure form of exteriority. And so there aren't intrinsic properties of a thing, but rather there are properties that it has produced within an assemblage that are therefore still kind of exterior to itself, or they're external machines filling up the body without organs that can nonetheless be broken. Hence, I think the line towards the bottom of this, that the self is nothing more than a character whose actions and emotions are desubjectified. And I think that, you know, in a nomadic settlement, they would want to say that something like the state or the economy or other things that we typically think of as very interior operate the same way in this kind of mode of exteriority, where there is not, like, an interior that is a reference that things are judged against, but there is just, like, a combination of things that produce a force, and that force is always reproduced or always changing. This slide is broadly about affect, which I think is very similar to intensity. The reason that I put it up here was basically to kind of get at that question, that I think the sort of description of affects as like a weapon that are exterior from the subject is interesting to me. If people have thoughts about affect, we can definitely talk about it, but if people have other thoughts or things they want to talk about, we can go there as well. Or we can go back to chess and go.
This is really interesting because this seems like just completely counter to sort of the current prevailing cultural understanding about feelings.
I think that's absolutely true. Yeah. There was a point in time, like I entered college wanting to be a philosophy and psychology dual major, kind of thinking like, oh, D&G are writing about emotions. And then the psychology classes were just like very contra. It's like all like inside. And you're right, I think one that is probably the prevailing cultural and maybe even scientific understanding of how feelings or subjectivity works. And it's just so different from, I think, the way that Deleuze and Guattari want to think about it. I think it's also interesting because I think maybe this more than anything else is what distinguishes their thought from just being like, well, you should do whatever you feel like. Because in many ways that is what they're saying, but they have this kind of theory of feeling that's so much beyond the self, or like, what do you feel like, that I think would kind of complicate being, it's like I don't know if that's Epicurean. Be like, do whatever you feel like, or do whatever gives you pleasure. But
that's Epicurean.
Okay. And I think that's where they would maybe break from that, as there's like, you know, what you want to do, like capital YU, is like only a very small component of what you want to do, because they're saying that, you know, desire or feeling comes from an entire assemblage rather than just like one person's feeling.
So when they say effects transpierce the body like arrows, they're weapons of war, are they talking about like these like effects piercing like your own body, or like the body of everyone else, like emanating from you? Or is it both?
I think it's both. There's that line in the Wolfman chapter that's like, it's easy to imagine as like the child thinking about wolves, but rather it's like the wolves looking at the child. I think affect is operating in a similar way. It's like there's something outside of you that is like piercing you, causing your assemblage to be reconfigured in a certain way. And similarly, your affects would do a different thing. Like you project an affect that transpierces someone's assemblage, rearranges their machines.
Yeah, I'm a little, I was just a little confused on this point about how affects, so like there are these kind of like, we have our individual feelings, and those kind of like participate in the feelings of the affects of the assemblage.
Right.
And this seems like an obvious problem, but they don't really address it. Like what does it mean when our kind of personal feelings don't align with the assemblage?
Can you give like, is there like a more particular example? Like, are you thinking about it's like in a societal sense, or like in this classroom, my affects don't align with the assemblage?
Sure, like in with like a political movement, like there might
Right.
be, there might be sort of kind of like underlying desires for the same political objective, but they might disagree. For example, like on the use of violence, like
Right. And is the question like, how do those things kind of interact, or?
yes, like how do those affects transpierce each other while also remaining themselves?
Okay. Well, I think like, I mean, D&G would certainly say there is sort of like a mutual composition. Like when you enter into a political movement that is maybe broadly against violence, then maybe that shapes your strategy. But at the same time, I think D&G are certainly more in a kind of like bottom-up analysis of things, where they certainly have descriptions. I think there may be more throughout Anti-Oedipus, but like things to the effect of the whole is just the sum of its parts, such that if you have kind of, we'll say, an individual affect within a machine or a political movement, like, you know, maybe violence is okay, I think that the more kind of rhizomatic procession of that for them would be that affect either kind of broadly reshapes the movement, or at least kind of like preserves its own kind of, like doesn't get, I guess, over-coded or re-territorialized, or maybe terms they would use. Like, that it's not like, oh, well, you know, I was super down for violence and I entered this movement that doesn't want to do it, so I'm giving up on violence, is I think maybe like a more arborescent reading of that. And I think that they would want to say that if the kind of, you know, revolutionary affect doesn't broadly change the movement, it maybe at least like carves out a space within it, even a space for just this one person that's like, actually this kind of affect is okay. I'm trying to think if there's
So,
like examples
like
of
to
this that I have.
simplify, like it's more the individual affect that transpierces the assemblage.
Yes.
Assemblage's affect.
Yeah. And I think the thing that where that gets weird is they're probably like, there's no such thing as an individual affect because they're all part of the assemblage.
Right.
But to the extent that you imagine like an affect emanating from one person, that is the thing that is
Yeah.
structuring like a broad political movement.
Because at least like, even if there are these kind of like, I don't know what you would call, like desires within in the assemblage that are like unaligned with the broader feeling, they're still taking place. within the
Yes.
assemblage.
Yeah. And I think maybe so. I really like this bottom quote, which is a description of the war machine as affirming its irreducibility, which was I guess a formulation I liked a lot. And there's also the small text part in the middle of this quote where they're like, the war machine displays its irreducibility by scattering into thinking, loving, dying, or creating machines that have at their disposal vital or revolutionary powers. And so maybe that's kind of a way to think about it. Like an individual affect as a kind of war machine is affirming its irreducibility, i.e. it will not let itself be kind of restructured by broad group demands that are like external to it and like this is not part of my assemblage, or it is not having a particularly strong functioning in my assemblage, but I have to assimilate to it. I think rather they want to think of this affect would be like, it would kind of ward off that, be like, no, this is something that is, not a shaping force in my assemblage, and so I'm not going to like assimilate towards it. If that kind of,
Yeah.
yeah.
Actually, kind of on the same note, Guattari has, I think it's a lecture called "Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist," and I feel like that kind of touches on the same thing, kind of like in like the protest sense, where it's like he kind of talks about how like there are like fascistic tendencies, like they go like a micro politics kind of, where you have like how am I trying to explain this? That oftentimes movements crush like the individual's voice, like the individual's like affect, into conforming to some kind of like larger goal. So if you look with like with a lot of like women's rights, like early women's rights stuff, they oftentimes excluded black women and like other minorities, and so it was only fighting for essentially like white women's rights. And so it's like they kind of like they crush the individual sentiment to conform to this broad movement. I think they kind of argue for a reformulation of the protest where it's like it's like a collective enunciation where it's like no voice is like quashed, but like everyone's voice adds to the kind of like revolutionary movement of it.
Yeah, and this is, Guattari engaged in a lot of organizing at the time he was writing. Like his history of like organizations that he jumped between in France is like extremely long. And I think he was certainly frustrated by the kind of like capital P party form that a lot of communist parties had, that like very firm party line where it's like, if you are part of this movement, you will do these things, you will leave these things outside. Hence, I think lines like this, or the kind of formulation of micro-fascism, that's like even if someone is, there's a movement that is broadly moving in the right direction or broadly sort of against fascism or against authoritarianism, there's still a chance that within that movement, it sort of has like you need to put these desires aside for a greater good, which Deleuze and Guattari would be critical of, because they would say that's, that's still fascism, just at like a scaled down form. Yeah.
So this maybe like segues well into another question I had about the war machine.
Okay.
Which he's using all these examples of like nomadic societies, right? And without taking that specific example like too far, I think his understanding of their understanding of violence is really interesting, and its relationship to the state. They say the state wants to prevent war, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is true that it wants to prevent war, but it seems to me like it actually, the state doesn't have an interest in preventing like violence.
Yeah.
So I guess one of my questions was, what is the distinction, I guess, for them between violence and war?
Okay. This is I'll get to that in a second. I want to see because I remember. Okay. I suppose this quote is maybe not as good as I thought it was. Anyway, so they make a distinction in the next plateau, which is they're trying to be like, I don't know, like give a historical account of how the state arises or whatever. But they make this distinction between there's like direct violence and structural violence, which I know structural violence is a popular term, and they want to say that like state violence is structural violence. And yeah, okay, it is in the first sentence it's highlighted here, where it's like there is both kind of a violence and then simultaneously like a right to capture in state violence. So there's both like a violent act, but then also a kind of law that gets formulated around it that is then used to broadly be like, well, then you cannot do these kinds of things, turns back and becomes repressive of desire.
Yeah.
In contrast to that, I think that they want to say the war machine is a fundamentally affirmative thing, hence the kind of first quote up here. And so the violence of the war machine is not something that is seeking to be sort of repressive, or it's like repressing a state or establishing a law of like you cannot establish a state. Hence the fact that the war machine only becomes violent when it sort of has its like ability to grow or develop nomad settlements restricted as it collides with a state. And so I think broadly that would be the way that I would distinguish them, or that I make sense of them in my head, is state violence sort of takes an object and is organized around the maintenance of that object. Like we need a peaceful, lawful society, and we use violence to sort of maintain that. Whereas the war machine's violence is a bit more, not necessarily random, but like spontaneous. They use the term direct violence, where there's not like a law that it is enforcing with this violence, but rather kind of like an instance of I am being prevented from doing something, maybe I have to use violence to allow myself to do that thing. But they're not trying to establish like an inside or a law, and are rather trying to have this kind of zone of exteriority and prevent it from becoming incorporated into the state.
So would an example of this sort of be like Israeli settlements, like in the West Bank, that might be illegal according to international or like Israeli law, but you know, whenever a settler enacts sort of violence on like a Palestinian village, for example, they might be engaging with the war machine. There's not any law. In fact, the law might even say that like you're not supposed to be even here in the first place, but they want to gain like this sort of exteriority from the rest of the Palestinian villages or villagers by enacting some sort of like violence against them. That's not structural, but it's like interpersonal.
Well, first of all, I would say that my go-to example that I think is like a pretty good example of what a war machine is in more contemporary times, like the Black Panther Party, in terms of the formulation of like affirming the irreducibility. Like there was certainly violence at times in terms of like cop watching patrols, etc. But there's also a component of it that I think was very obviously trying to sort of, you know, affirm like a inability for a deterritorialized existence in terms of things like the healthcare that's provided, the breakfast clubs. My secondary thought is that every time that I've thought about like Israel and Palestine, I've always seen more of a war machine like on the side of the Palestinians, in the sense that it often feels like, for the most part, obviously generalizing, but you know, kind of Zionist violence feels a lot more like it's, you know, around the sort of formation of an object. It's like we want a protected state of Israel and are using violence to sort of manufacture that. We're trying to, you know, like prevent Palestinians from being within that. So it feels more like the kind of structural violence. Whereas, again, not holistically, but there's a lot of times where Palestinian acts of violence feel a lot less like they're trying to structure like a Palestinian state as much as they are trying to be like, you know, our land is being folded into something that is not ours, our ability to live is being restricted, and we are trying to prevent that from happening.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can see how that makes sense.
And I guess my concern with that distinction is that like, even if the object of structural violence might be more explicitly articulated, it still seems like this non-structural, this direct violence still takes an object beyond defending its own freedom. Like, if, you know, I could go over to like Catherine's house and like, I feel comfortable saying this because we're friends. I could like,
Yeah.
I could like shoot Catherine.
Right.
And be like, all your things are mine now. And that's not structural violence. I'm not enforcing a law in the
Right.
sense that I have this, you know, this code that I'm trying to, but I'm enforcing the law in a way of my own will. Like, I want this thing and I'm going to hurt other people to get it.
Right. And my read on that is for D&G, I think structural violence means like violence that takes an object. And so the way that you've described this scenario in the back half, you're not necessarily enforcing like a law of the state or whatever, but you have enforced this, you know, sort of law of like my own will, I will do whatever I want. And, you know, if I think about this scenario, it seems difficult to conceptualize an assemblage that involves you and Catherine, where you're like, I can just shoot Catherine and take all of her stuff without, you know, some kind of object in there that's like, I get to enforce my will, impose my will, all things must bend to myself, etc. As far as the broader question of like, can you have direct violence without an object? I think to some extent this is, you know, this is just going to be like a D&G versus Lacan distinction, because Lacan's account of desire is certainly going to be everything has an object, and so even if it's implicit, any act of direct violence has an object that it's organized around. I think D&G are wanting to distinguish with this in this kind of, you know, they're making a formal distinction between what a nomad society is like and what a state society is like. And I think that broadly they're trying to think of the nomad society more like a rhizome or an assemblage, where it is not organized around securing an object, but rather as a set of intensities that sort of produce something. And so for them, I think the act of violence is produced like without being structured around an object, but more as like a response to intensity. And if that doesn't sound like a particularly persuasive account of how things happen, then I think like Lacan is maybe a better author in terms of like making sense of these things for you.
Okay.
But yeah, I also think that like, you know, the distinction between direct violence and structural violence is not necessarily the scale of them, but D&G would want to say it's the form. Anything that takes an object is structural violence. And anything that, you know, is a response to intensity without an object is direct violence, regardless of the scale of them.
Okay.
Both you and I'll let you talk first because you just got shot and had all your things stolen.
Yeah, thank you. Welcome back. Yes, it's great to be here. So, I was wondering, how literal do they mean much of this passage? Like, they talk about like the two pillars of society, the like law and magician.
Yeah, the magician, king, the jurist, priest. Yeah.
Yeah, and like, and the war machine being this third thing that comes in and can be like sublimated. Like, are they meaning this in like a this is how things tend to happen, or like this is a way of seeing the world, or are they literally saying every single society has always worked in like this, like they're either a war machine or this two-pronged thing that like can then sublimate it?
I think they're certainly more on the first side. I think D&G are broadly, when they use examples, i.e. chess and Go, they're not trying to be like chess is fascist. They're like, there is a certain thing demonstrated by chess that we would call arborescent or whatever, and certain properties within chess demonstrate this. I think that their description of Indo-European mythology and the jurist priest versus magician king is trying to do a similar thing, where they're like, these are dynamics expressed within mythology that express a certain vision of the state. Because even, you know, later into this passage, and certainly throughout the book, even to the extent they would be like every state is either like a capital S state or a war machine, they also have lines that are like, these things are always intermixed. Like, there's probably no state, like country in existence that is 100% state or 100% war machine. You have pockets of each within the other. I have a broader thought that I made like a long slide for about like how D&G use examples that I will maybe go to after Arrow's question.
So I was just wondering, because I was reading through parts of like What is Philosophy by Muslim, and when they're talking about planes of immanence, the analogies they use to describe the population of deserts and nomads seems very very similar to the way they talk about like ideas or like ways of organizing planes of imminence.
Yes.
So what's the relation between those two?
The way that I would explain the organization between these two, I'd like transitive property is. In the how do you make yourself a body without organs plateau, they describe the body without organs as a plane of immanence, or, even the plane of immanence, like if you take like the body without organs of everything. And I think that also throughout 1,000 plateaus, they're like an example of the body without organs is a desert. Re the kind of articulation of the war machine or exteriority as a body without organs, of like there's not a whole, but it's kind of an empty space that fills up with in intensities. To that extent, the desert is a BWO. And I think the plane of immanence for them operates in a sort of similar way. Like it's, there's not like a transcendent structure it's organized around, it rather fills up with certain immanent processes. And so I think that, like if I was gonna be annoying, I would be like BWO equals desert equals plane of immanence. But I think that all three of those are sort of expressing a similar thing, which is this kind of like n equals 0 / n minus 1 is like a base point for intensity that doesn't have a whole that is derived from or related to, but is just kind of a plane that sort of fills up with intensity or thought over time.
And when you say whole, that's kind of like talking about like anti-Lacan stuff here.
Yeah. Or, I mean, it certainly is anti-Lacan, but Lacan would also be like wholeness is impossible. There are a lot of thinkers who are like, there's like a whole form, or like, I don't know. It probably the most direct is kind of like anti-Plato.
I don't know if you're saying WH or H.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
I'm saying
okay.
WH whole.
Okay,
WH whole, yeah.
That makes more sense.
There is that fun line that I cannot attest to at all, if it's true or not, but there's that line in the Wolfman Plateau where they're like, physicists say that holes are just light moving faster than, or something like that,
Yeah,
where they're like,
that's
holes are
really
actually particles. And I was like, that's really interesting, and I have no idea if that's true. Every time they say something like science-y in this book, I'm just like, I'm going to read it as a metaphor, because I really do not trust them to know what they're talking about. I know that there were like French people, I said that and it sounded very derogatory. There were people in France after the publication of either Anti-Oedipus or 1,000 Plateaus, there's like French scientists that wrote a book that was just like, philosophers are so bad at using science, and almost the entire book is hallucinatory. So, and then they have a line in the first plateau of this book where they're like, we are pop philosophy even if people are mad about the pseudoscience in it or something. So they have a little back and forth. Moral of the story, if they say something about science, get like an external reference or read it as a metaphor. If people don't have an immediate thought they want to jump to, I made that, and then I also told, oh, go ahead.
I do have a question. It's about the state not owning a war machine, but it's actually okay for the military institution to own a war machine. Is the military institution not part of the state, or they're like distinct entities?
Did you say is a military institution?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And that's this slide, which is, I think it's kind of so that like the way that we would thing we would typically think about when we think of war machine is like, people criticize the war machine is like something where we make war for its own sake. All of society is organized around making war. In D&G, you want to say, I don't know if they're intentionally trying to like be subversive and be like, it's not actually what you think it is. But they're like, when a war machine becomes that kind of military institution, it's when a war machine is appropriated by the state. And for them, that means that it is given war as its object. So for a nomadic war machine, it's not necessarily organized around making war. It might have to make war under certain conditions. For the state, when it appropriates a war machine, it is organized around making war. I also thought there was a kind of interesting connection in this kind of reading of like, the state will appropriate the war machine, but it will constantly cause it problems because it could always be disobedient, it could always operate against the state. I thought there was a kind of interesting read analogous to Marx in this, like the Marxist conception of labor, where, like capital obviously relies on labor. At the same time, that's sort of its weakness that, proletarians and the labor can revolt. I think there's maybe sort of an interesting connection between that and the reading of the war machine, where there's an appropriation of something, and that thing that is appropriated has the ability to kind of, break free and cause problems to the entire structure, which I thought was interesting.
So is the way I'm reading this like correct? The war machine is like an assemblage that is like responsive to specific intensities, and these intensities that D&G talk about are maybe like societal formations, either like nomadic or like with this state.
Yeah.
Okay. What would like a nomadic war machine look like?
Well, the nomadic war machine is what they're trying to describe as like the, it only takes war when its ability to exist as nomads is restricted. I'm sure there's more examples, but I know that one of them that is in these passages that we read is like the biblical story of Moses, where they get kicked out of Egypt, they go wander across the desert, and at a certain point they come to the realization that like we're running into cities that are persecuting us and having to go to battle with them, is like an example of a nomadic war machine, where like one is like literally nomadic. They've been kicked out of their home and are wandering around the desert. But there's also like the only reason that they make war against these states is because their sort of mode of life is being prevented, and it's like this is like we are coming to collide with the state. Our options are like be persecuted by it or assimilate into it or go to war with it, and then they go to war with it. They do also have passages throughout this about like, they certainly describe, when they are describing guerrilla warfare throughout this plateau, it seems like they're describing it more as if it is a war machine. And so I imagine if you think of like instances of guerrilla warfare throughout history, D&G would want to say that those are probably generally more on the side of like a nomadic war machine. Even if they're not necessarily like literally nomadic, they have this sort of property of like they are broadly affirming their own existence against a state rather than trying to institute their own state.
And how do G&G like characterize the state going about like appropriating the war machine for its own devices?
I know that they're like historical. Oh, I don't know. Genghis Khan is their big like this guy was a war machine, and they certainly are like the state like there are people, one of the things Genghis Khan did, in my understanding, this is based on reading this chapter, so maybe they're doing the science thing and just lying for a fact again, but they're like, certain nomads from Genghis Khan's armies would integrate into the empires they conquered, and that maybe that is where like states started to get the idea of developing their own war machine, and or maybe it was Genghis Khan's predecessor, like basically develops like a war machine as military institution. Or even, I think they make a distinction later where there's two kinds of appropriation. There's one where it's like, the state is like, we will make our own war machine, and it basically makes a copy of it, like it's recruiting from internally, versus there are times where like Rome did it with the barbarians or whatever, like they literally take a war machine outside and are like, we're enlisting you, like we're paying you, you're part of the state now. But I think broadly, those are some historical examples, but the war machine being appropriated by the state is when a state is like, we need the ability to make war to enforce our aims, and therefore goes about either internally or externally appropriating or constructing its own war machine.
Okay. Do armed bodies in the state also play a role in the war machine, like cops, for example? Or are they kind of like their own separate thing?
I think that's interesting. I know that there are passages within this where they say like, at first, states did not have a war machine because they had things like the police or whatever. And so I think the like armed bodies are certainly doing a similar thing in terms of they're enforcing the existence of the state or protecting the interior. I think D&G maybe do want to make a distinction insofar as cops or armed bodies might not have, at least not to the same extent, that property of like, these are constantly causing the state problems, where like a war machine appropriated by the state can always rebel against it. And I think D&G might at least be saying the potential is less so there with armed bodies, because it's kind of created internally to the state for the state's maintenance, rather than being, you take a force that could destroy the state and try and control it from within.
So I guess, another question I guess that brings up is, why hasn't, like in first world or like OECD nations, your first like imperial core, whatever you want to say, why hasn't the state and the war machine gone like, have been more at odds with each other? Because I feel like I see all the time it's at the imperial core, there might be like a military
like takeover of the state, yeah.
Like I think there was one, recently in Myanmar.
Yes.
So like like why is the war machine and the state so compatible in first world countries, but not so much outside of like our sphere?
It's a very interesting question. I think if D&G were to give a one-word answer, it would be like capitalism. I know that later, or like the last couple of pages of this plateau, they talk about this kind of process where, due to capitalism, war machines appropriated by the state increasingly turn to like total war rather than limited war. That even the state becomes like subordinated to the means of like constantly making war / protecting peace. And so I think there's some part of it where there's like a material dimension by which capitalism maybe enables both the state and the war machine to centralize around a single object. I think there might be a secondary dimension of it that's more kind of like ideological, quote unquote, in a Marxist sense, that like whether it's like propaganda or broad like cultural kind of integration, it seems like the United States military is much more faithful to the United States and would not really consider rebelling against it, either because they just happen to have the same interests or because the United States is better at, like, I don't know, propaganda, et cetera, keeping those interests aligned.
I do think you're right. Like there is a material sort of component to it where I think the U.S., specifically like the U.S. federal government, like in recent decades, have shifted more towards like the production of like arms, munitions, like tanks, like weapons of war. I think like this has been sort of like accelerated like under the Trump administration. You see like cuts, like massive cuts to like social spending, social safety nets, security, stuff like that, and there's like a larger emphasis on funding more munitions, more weapons of war, etc. The state has also like almost in itself become like a company that sells out to other
Right.
countries
And
munitions that are created here.
I think it's also interesting because that description is what people would usually call the war machine when they're referring to it.
Absolutely. Like the
yeah.
military industrial complex, like when you're looking
Exactly.
at like Eisenhower's like beware the military industrial complex,
Right.
it will like take over the government or whatever. And I feel like traditionally when you like go around left wing circles, that's sort of what they
Right.
they criticize.
I think it is interesting, and honestly, it probably does them more harm than good that war machine is the term they chose, because people hear war machine and they're like, oh, that's like a bad thing that we critique. But yeah, I think that is. And here's the quote about it. Yeah.
I think there's also like a difference in, like you use the term imperial, or like there's a big difference in the ability of states that are that large and powerful to export violence. So they can basically just send their war machine somewhere else and
Exactly. Yeah.
And if you compare that with like with more like kind of like fledgling like liberal democratic states, that becomes a lot harder. Like during the time Deleuze is writing like Latin America, you had this actual struggle between the state and the war machine happening all the time. Like
Yeah. And I guess this is kind of interesting to me in the relative exterior versus interior and the exteriority distinction, I think, in terms of like, there are certainly certain strands of politics or even Marxism that are like, think about, I think, their conception of the third world is very much like a relative. It's like exterior to the interior, and that is where the sort of revolutionary potential lies, where I think D&G are like, it is exterior insofar as it like demonstrates the characteristics of exteriority. I don't know, I think maybe interesting / case in point is there's kind of like the Middle Eastern states that, in some sense pose a threat to the United States in terms of they have like a stranglehold on a strategic resource, but the way that they use that is often to kind of, reestablish their own kind of state power, integrate into the global capitalist order, as opposed to kind of using it as a threat or like a leverage tool to sort of maintain social relations outside of it.
So they kind of give up on developing their war machine?
Yeah, and instead are like, we can use this to become another state.
Okay. Yeah.
All right. If there's no other immediate thoughts people have, I think it's actually, okay. Yeah, I'll go to this slide. It kind of gets at Catherine's question from like way earlier. And this is also just like if I could preach and be like, you know, I think this is broadly a thing that's kind of important. I'll explain why there's a Minecraft picture there if there's time. The other preface I would give on this is that, and there's an asterisk next to this, this is an idea out of my own brain. Not really, I just came up with like the name for it. But, you know, Deleuze and Guattari do not use the word nevermore. This is a thing that I was writing about. They do have the line, I was very proud of myself for remembering this from memory because there's a bunch of weird small words in it and I got the order of them right. But the principle behind all technology is that a technical element remains abstract, entirely undetermined, as long as one does not relate it to an assemblage it presupposes. And I think this is something that I think is certainly important reading Deleuze and Guattari. I think it helps also reading like postmodern authors broadly, and I would even contend that like it helps reading any kind of philosophy. So kind of the thing that we were talking about earlier, it's like when they're talking about chess as an example, they're not literally being like chess is bad. They're like chess demonstrates a certain set of characteristics that can be contrasted to Go, and these characteristics demonstrate a certain thing. I think you get a similar kind of thing in these lines on the right, where, for example, they're like, you know, the nomads are not what makes a war machine because they're nomadic. Rather, it's this sort of constellation of characteristics. These could also be demonstrated in any ideological, scientific, or artistic movement if they, like nomads do, draw a smooth space. Or, you know, elsewhere, they're like, you know, smooth space and exteriority are not inherently revolutionary, but they change meaning drastically depending on their conditions. Slash, even just throughout the plateau, they make a distinction. Like there's royal science and nomad science, or there's state thought and nomad thought. And so this is something I think D&G certainly do, but I also think a lot of authors do, where they're, you know, there's kind of the like postmodern critique of signifiers that like a word does not necessarily have a certain quality. And so I think when reading D&G or other postmodernists, it can be useful not to read like a word, an example, in a vacuum as like they have said this thing is bad, but they're rather like this thing demonstrates a certain characteristic or set of characteristics, and that is what we're critiquing. I think like Baudrillard's an example of this because he loves to rage bait, and he'll have like a sentence where he critiques like medicine and seatbelts, and if you take him literally, it's like, what are you doing, John? It's like, I can't, there's no way I could possibly defend this. But if you read it generously, it's like he's pointing to a certain dynamic that's expressed within that. And I think, at least for me, it has been helpful to read authors like D&G or authors generally kind of generously. And when you see a like sentence that at first looks like kind of a like crackpot sentence, like they think chess is fascist or whatever, it's like asking, well, what does chess like symbolize within this sentence? The reason I call it Nevermore is actually Minecraft reasons, but if you want like a very concise, like there's a literal poem by Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, and the whole kind of gist of that poem is there is a raven that says literally the same line like 4 or 5 times over and over again, and despite the words being literally the same, it has a very different feeling at the end of every paragraph because, you know, the paragraph preceding it is different. What the person is saying to the raven or how he's thinking about the raven is different. And so what this kind of like concept symbolizes to me is, I think, what's expressed within this, the principle behind all technology, etc., which is that a particular signifier, a particular machine, does not have like a good or bad essence, or even like a rhizomatic and arborescent essence, but it is contingent on what it is doing within a certain assemblage. And so I think that can be useful as a way to read philosophy. I also think it can be useful when you think about Deleuze and Guattari or the war machine, given their kind of claim that they're like anything can become a war machine if you engage with it as a sort of, you know, like affirmative way or a way to develop intensities rather than something taking an object. We have 5 minutes. Are there any other things that people want to talk about, like last thoughts on Deleuze? Or
does the war machine always have to be like material, or can it like take place ideologically?
I think it could take place ideologically, or D&G are like everything is a machine / everything is sexuality, and so for them like material versus ideological is like basically a non-existent distinction. They're like anything that would work in a material realm would also work in an ideological realm.
Could you give like a contemporary example of how the War Machine takes place like ideologically? 'Cause I struggle to like
Conceptualize it.
Yeah, conceptualize it.
Yeah, I would also say if anyone else has thoughts about this, you're welcome to join in.
Like church. Church can be a war machine.
I don't disagree with that. There's sometimes where I go to a sermon and I'm like, this pastor is talking about things in a way that seems to subvert all the like bad rep that Christianity gets, which is maybe a version of it. Like, you can take something that's often.
Not even church, academia. Academia is the main places for a war machine.
What about art? Does this have anything to do with like the contra art that we were talking about?
I think it can, yeah. I think there's a lot of times where artistic movements try and kind of, do things that are counter-hegemonic or, like,
Like situationalists seems like a good example. You familiar with them at all?
No.
They okay, in the 60s, there's like, I think they were like a French movement, they pioneered like the concept of like subvertising, which is like going up on billboards and like vandalizing them to make them say different things but with the same like product logo on them. That feels like,
yeah,
I don't know.
I think it is. And then I also think, I think there are a lot of pockets on the internet that to me, and there's like they're small war machines, right? But they kind of carve out a space on the internet. There's like sub communities or whatever.
Like 4chan?
Probably not 4chan.
I'm just saying there were a lot of communities.
There are a lot of sub communities on 4chan for sure. But I think there are certainly pockets on the internet where people kind of develop, it seems like, a culture that does not necessarily have like a state or something that things are organized around, and that is more kind of decentered.
So if we can consider like art and church and like situations kind of as like war machines, could we kind of consider everything as like a war machine? Like if I have a conversation with you and we disagree on our ideas, does that mean that we're all of a sudden like acting as war machines to each other?
I think the fundamental thing that D&G would try and say is like the way you interact with anything that exists should be like, how can I make this a war machine? Or how can I make myself a war machine? I think it is possible that two people could have a conversation and disagree, and it could not be a war machine because they take an object, they're like, this person is opposed to me, I need to maintain my own belief system, confirmation bias, etc. I think it's also possible that you could have a conversation with someone and their words can be affects, they change the composition of your assemblage. And so, and I think that's what this sort of slide attests to. The fundamental question for D&G is not like, is this thing a war machine? Because the answer is always, it can be under a certain set of conditions. And so I think the thing that their philosophy is trying to get at is like, how do we make this a war machine? The broad answer to which is, engage with it in terms of intensities or an assemblage or like affirmative production rather than taking a object deemed desirable and organizing all production around that center point. That seems like a place that we could end on D&G for me. If yes, everybody in this class is a war machine. Hooray. I'll leave this up here. If anyone has D&G questions or wants to be like, your lectures are good or bad, or here are things that are good or bad, there's this. If anyone wants to talk after class or whatever, I have like 40 minutes. Yeah. Thank you all for letting me teach class for 3 days. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for teaching.
Hooray.